I was halfway through my third night shift when I realized the fog below the platform wasn't reacting to the wind the way it always had, drifting sideways instead of breaking apart like it should. I remember checking the anemometer twice, convinced exhaustion was making me misread the numbers, then noticing my radio had been quiet for far too long. Inside the night office, taped beside the emergency procedures, was a page I hadn't seen before, listing 11 strange rules I was expected to follow if I wanted to finish my rotation. I didn't believe in them at first, but I still catch myself wondering which one noticed me before I noticed it. The rule didn't come from a briefing or a supervisor's warning. It came from a laminated sheet taped crookedly beside the night logs, and I noticed it only because my pen stopped working when I tried to write about the fog. The first paragraph under the heading explained nothing, just stated Rule 1, never acknowledge the fog when it begins moving against the wind, and even reading it made my throat tighten in a way I couldn't explain. I stood there longer than I should have, listening to the rig's low vibrations travel through the floor into my boots, aware that I was already breaking the rule just by thinking about whether it applied to me. The night office felt smaller then, like the walls had leaned in while I was reading. I tried to convince myself the wording was metaphorical, something left over from an older crew with too much time and not enough sleep. Oil rigs collect weird traditions the way ships collect rust, and I had heard stories about lucky helmets and cursed bunks before. Still, the fog outside the window didn't behave like weather, it behaved like intention, thickening and thinning, in slow pulses that didn't match the sea below. I remember thinking that if I didn't log it, I was neglecting my duty, and if I did, I might be crossing a line I didn't understand. The radio crackled faintly then, not with a voice but with a pressure that felt like someone pressing their thumb against my eardrum from the inside. I lifted the handset and said my call sign out of habit, then stopped halfway through the routine check, my mouth suddenly dry. There was a moment where I almost mentioned the fog to fill the silence, the way people do when they're nervous, and the urge scared me more than the fog itself. It felt like the rig was waiting to see if I'd say it out loud. I stepped outside onto the catwalk to clear my head, the metal cold even through my gloves, and the fog rolled beneath me like a slow tide that refused to settle. The wind was steady, pushing toward the east, but the fog leaned west, climbing upward in a way that made no sense. I kept my eyes on the handrail, counting bolts to keep from staring too long, because staring felt like recognition. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet certainty formed that noticing too much was the same as permission. Mark, the relief supervisor, found me there a few minutes later, his boots announcing him before his voice did. He asked if everything was normal, and the word normal felt dangerous in my mouth, like it might slip and turn into something else. I told him the gauges looked fine, and that the night was calm, choosing my words carefully without fully understanding why. He nodded, but his eyes flicked toward the fog for just a second too long, then snapped back to me as if he'd caught himself making a mistake. When Mark left, I realized my hands were shaking, not from cold but from restraint, like I was holding back a confession I didn't know how to make. The rule sheet stayed in my mind as I made my rounds, every shadow on the deck seeming sharper, every light more fragile. I started noticing how often people avoided certain phrases, how conversations bent around topics instead of touching them directly. It dawned on me that the rules weren't about controlling the environment, they were about controlling language. Back in the night office, I pulled the old logs from the cabinet, flipping through months of neat entries that mentioned equipment failures, supply delays, and weather changes in careful, bland terms. There were gaps where I expected details, entire nights summarized in a single sentence that said nothing at all. It was like reading around a hole in reality, the absence louder than anything written. I wondered how many supervisors before me had learned to write without describing what they saw. The fog pressed closer to the platform as the hours dragged on, curling around the lower supports in thick layers that swallowed the lights one by one. I found myself holding my breath when I glanced down, as if breathing too loudly might draw attention. Every time I thought the word fog, a flicker of unease ran through me, like my thoughts weren't as private as I'd assumed. I started referring to it as that even in my own head, hoping vagueness would count as caution. Around 2 in the morning, an alarm chimed softly, signaling a routine system check, and the sound felt intrusive against the heavy quiet. I completed the checklist methodically, grateful for the distraction, but my eyes kept drifting to the window despite myself. The fog's movement had slowed, becoming almost imperceptible, which somehow felt worse, like it was waiting. I wondered if acknowledging it meant more than speaking, if writing or even thinking counted as an invitation. I thought about the people who had written the rules, imagined them standing where I stood now, wrestling with the same doubts. Were they scared when they first noticed, or did fear come later, after they understood the consequences? The idea that someone had tested the boundary so thoroughly that they'd felt the need to write it down made my stomach twist. Whatever happened to teach them this rule hadn't been subtle or quick. By the time my shift was nearly over, exhaustion had settled into my bones, making everything feel slightly unreal. The fog hadn't reached the deck, but it felt closer than it should have been, like a presence just out of reach. I avoided the window altogether, focusing on the ticking clock and the hum of the systems, telling myself that morning light would fix everything. Even as I thought it, I knew daylight didn't mean safety out here, just visibility. When my replacement arrived, I gave the briefest handover I could manage, sticking to numbers and statuses, careful not to linger on anything unnecessary. He didn't ask about the fog, and I didn't volunteer it, and the unspoken agreement between us felt heavier than words. As I stepped off the rig and onto the transport, I looked back once, just long enough to see the fog settle into place, like it had never moved at all. That was when I understood the instability the rule left behind, the sense that something had noticed my restraint and was deciding what it meant. I didn't notice when the night office door started drifting open on its own, only that the air inside felt different, heavier, like it had been held too long in someone else's lungs. And that was when I remembered Rule 2. Never let the night office door stay open after 1 a.m. The clock above the console read 1:17, the red digits steady and unforgiving, and the door was open just enough to show the dark hallway beyond. I stood frozen for a moment, hands still on my mug, trying to convince myself I'd simply forgotten to pull it shut after my last round. The idea that the door had chosen to open didn't feel like imagination. It felt like an accusation. The night office is small by design, packed tight with monitors, binders, and the hum of systems that never truly rest. When the door is closed, the room feels contained, almost safe, like the rest of the rig has been politely kept at a distance. With the door open, the office felt exposed, as if the hallway could see in, and the thought made my skin prickle. I told myself it was just fatigue playing tricks on me, the kind that turns shadows into problems and silence into threats. I walked over slowly, each step measured, listening to the faint vibrations through the soles of my boots. The hallway lights were dimmed for night operations, stretching the corridor into a long tunnel of muted metal and shadow. Nothing moved out there, and that somehow made it worse, like the absence itself was watching me. I reached for the door handle and hesitated, my fingers hovering just short of the cold steel. Closing the door should have been automatic, but something about the moment felt loaded, like a test I hadn't studied for. I wondered why the rules specified after 1 a.m., why that particular hour mattered more than any other. The rig runs on schedules, but fear doesn't, and my chest felt tight as I finally wrapped my hand around the handle. The metal was colder than I expected, sending a sharp reminder up my arm. As I pulled the door shut, the hinges resisted slightly, not enough to stop me, just enough to be noticed. The latch clicked into place with a firmness that felt final, and the change in the room was immediate. The air seemed to settle, the hum of the equipment smoothing out into something almost normal. I leaned my forehead briefly against the door, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself that rules like this existed to enforce routine, nothing more. Open doors invite distraction. Distraction leads to mistakes, and mistakes offshore can be deadly. That explanation almost worked, right up until I noticed the faint outline on the floor where the door usually rested, a scuffed arc that suggested it spent more time open than it should. The realization made me uneasy, in a way I couldn't quite articulate. I returned to the console and forced myself back into the rhythm of the shift, checking readings, responding to routine alerts, marking time. Every few minutes, my eyes flicked to the door, half expecting it to be open again. It stayed shut, solid and unremarkable, which should have been reassuring. Instead, the waiting gnawed at me, like I'd interrupted something that might try again when I wasn't looking. Sometime later, I heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and unhurried, moving past the office without stopping. Night shifts are quiet, but they're never empty, and I told myself it was just another crew member making their rounds. Still, the footsteps didn't sound quite right, too even, too deliberate, like they weren't in a hurry to get anywhere. I found myself staring at the door, listening until the sound faded into the background vibrations of the rig. The thought crossed my mind that an open door is an invitation, not just for people but for attention. With it closed, the night office felt like a boundary, a line drawn between inside and out. I wondered how many times before me, someone had ignored that boundary, propping the door open for convenience, not knowing or not caring what that might mean. The rules suddenly felt less arbitrary and more like a response to something specific and unwanted. Around 2 o'clock, a status alert flashed on one of the monitors, a minor fluctuation that didn't require action, but demanded acknowledgement. As I logged it, I noticed a faint draft brush the back of my neck, cool and fleeting. My heart jumped before my mind caught up, and I spun around to face the door. It was still closed, unmoved, offering no explanation for the chill that lingered just long enough to be felt. I sat back down slowly, trying to steady my breathing, telling myself that ventilation systems shift all the time. The rational explanations stacked up easily, but they felt thin, like excuses rather than answers. I couldn't shake the sense that something had tested the boundary and found it intact, for now. The idea that for now might be the key part kept looping in my thoughts. As the night wore on, fatigue deepened, blurring the edges of my focus and making the hours stretch. I caught myself nodding off once, jerking awake with a start and an immediate glance toward the door. It hadn't moved, but the relief I felt was disproportionate, intense enough to leave me slightly embarrassed. I realized then how quickly the rules had gone from odd to necessary in my mind. Just before the end of my shift, I stood up to do one last round, pausing with my hand on the door handle from the inside. The hallway beyond waited in silence, the dim lights casting long, empty reflections. For a brief, irrational moment, I imagined opening the door wide and leaving it that way, daring the rule to prove itself. The thought felt wrong in a way that had nothing to do with policy and everything to do with instinct. I left the door closed and finished my shift without incident, but the unease followed me off the rig, settling somewhere deep and persistent. The fog below had thinned slightly, the wind finally seeming to have its way, but I didn't find comfort in that. Rules don't exist because danger is constant. They exist because it comes and goes, unpredictable and selective. As I handed over to the next supervisor, I realized the door wasn't just about what stayed out, but about what stayed in, and that thought refused to settle into anything resembling peace. I didn't hear this one from a person, and I didn't read it calmly the way I pretended to with the others, because Rule 3, never stay on the lower deck after the fog reaches the third support column, announced itself. Through a change in how the rig felt under my feet. I was midway through a routine inspection, boots ringing softly against the metal grating, when the vibration pattern shifted just enough to catch my attention. The fog below had thickened again, and this time it wasn't drifting aimlessly, but climbing with slow patience, wrapping itself around the massive support columns that held the platform above the sea. I remember counting without meaning to, the way you do when you're nervous, realizing I was watching the third column disappear. The lower deck has always been an in-between place, not fully exposed to the sea but never truly part of the platform either. It smells like salt, old paint, and damp metal, and every sound feels amplified there, bouncing strangely off the supports and vanishing into the open air. I had been sent down to check a pressure gauge that liked to misbehave at night, a task I'd done dozens of times before without incident. That familiarity made it harder to accept the sudden urge to leave, an instinct so strong it felt almost rude to ignore. I leaned over the railing, keeping my eyes on the column instead of the fog itself, telling myself I was just being thorough. The first two columns were already swallowed up to their midpoint, the fog clinging to them like something alive and stubborn. When it reached the third, the air around me seemed to thicken, not visibly, but in a way that made breathing feel slightly delayed. It was like the rig had taken a shallow breath and was waiting to see what I'd do next. I told myself there was no rule posted down here, nothing taped to the bulkheads, or scribbled in a logbook to warn me off. The absence of a sign almost felt intentional, as if this was something you were supposed to learn by noticing, rather than being told. My radio was quiet, the comforting background chatter absent, and the silence pressed in close. I felt suddenly exposed, like the deck was a stage, and I'd stepped into the wrong scene. As the fog crept higher, a strange sensation settled over me, not fear exactly, but the sense of being out of sync. The rig's usual hum seemed distant, muted, as if I'd moved just slightly out of phase with everything else. I glanced back toward the stairwell, measuring the distance, surprised by how far away it suddenly seemed. Leaving felt urgent in a way that had nothing to do with policy or procedure. I started walking back, boots moving faster than I'd planned, and that was when I noticed the time distortion. Each step felt stretched, like the space between my footfalls had lengthened, while the fog's progress seemed unnervingly efficient by comparison. I told myself I was imagining it, that stress and poor sleep were warping my perception. Even so, I didn't slow down. Halfway to the stairs, I felt a subtle pressure against my back, not a touch, but a suggestion, like standing too close to someone without realizing it. The urge to turn around was almost overwhelming, a curiosity sharpened into something close to compulsion. I knew, without knowing how, that looking directly at the fog now would mean staying longer than I intended. That understanding felt ancient, older than the rig, older than the sea around it. My radio crackled then, a brief burst of static followed by my name, spoken softly and without urgency. It sounded like Mark, but wrong somehow, flattened and distant, as if his voice had traveled farther than it should have. I answered automatically, then froze, realizing I'd done so without checking the time or my surroundings. The reply didn't come, leaving the air heavy with unanswered expectation. I reached the base of the stairs, just as the fog wrapped fully around the third column, the metal vanishing behind a smooth, pale curtain. The sensation of being watched intensified, not focused, but diffuse, like attention spread thin across a wide surface. I took the steps two at a time, heart pounding, resisting the urge to look back. The lower deck seemed to recede behind me, stretching away as if reluctant to let me go. At the top, I paused longer than I should have, bent over with my hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. The fog hadn't followed me up, but I could feel its presence below, patient and unbothered by my retreat. I realized then that the rule wasn't about physical danger in the way safety briefings usually are. It was about timing, about knowing when a place stopped being meant for you. Later, back in the night office, I pulled up the external camera feeds, cycling through angles until I found the lower deck view. The fog obscured most of it, but the outline of the third column was still visible, wrapped tight and unmoving. I found myself holding my breath again, waiting for something to change. Nothing did, and that somehow felt worse. I replayed the moment in my head, wondering what would have happened if I'd lingered just a little longer. The thought carried a strange weight, like remembering a path you almost took, and sensing how differently things might have turned out. I didn't feel relief so much as narrow avoidance, like I'd slipped through a gap that wasn't meant to stay open long. That awareness sat heavy in my chest. The rest of the shift passed without incident, but my sense of time never quite settled back into place. Minutes stretched and snapped back unpredictably, making it hard to judge how long anything took. I checked the clock more often than necessary, grounding myself in the certainty of numbers. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had marked the moment I left the lower deck, not as a failure, but as a note taken for later. When daylight finally crept in, thinning the fog and restoring the familiar shape of the sea, the lower deck looked harmless again. The support columns stood bare and solid, offering no hint of the threshold they'd briefly become. I knew better than to trust that appearance, because rules like this don't exist for conditions you can see coming. They exist for moments when staying 1 second too long turns into something you can't walk away from, and that understanding refused to let me relax. By the time I realized the fog had shifted slightly again, creeping between the support cables, like liquid smoke, I remembered Rule 4. Always log every abnormal movement of the fog, no matter how small, and felt the weight of it press against my chest. I grabbed the tablet from the night office, fingers trembling despite gloves, and tried to type as quickly as possible while the fog blurred my peripheral vision. Every pulse of condensation along the metal railings seemed deliberate, timed, like someone or something was deciding when and where it would appear next. The lights above flickered faintly in response to my hurried entries, making the room feel smaller, almost claustrophobic, though the office had always been compact. Logging wasn't just about documentation. It felt like an act of survival, a quiet acknowledgement that could either protect or condemn you depending on precision. I scrolled through previous entries, noticing gaps I hadn't realized before, blank spaces between the meticulous numbers where other people might have hesitated, distracted, or unwilling to see what they saw. The fog outside didn't care about documentation. It moved with its own rhythm, brushing against the deck supports with an unnatural patience that made every written word feel simultaneously urgent and futile. Each note I typed felt heavier than the last, a small anchor tied to something larger and unexplainable. I kept my back to the office door, aware that leaving it open could breach Rule 2 without meaning to, but the need to capture the fog's motion compelled me. The tablet glowed pale in the dim light, casting my shadow across the wall in elongated, awkward shapes that merged with the rig's structures. Each time the fog shifted, even slightly, my hand itched to record it, to label the movement, and in doing so, I began to sense patterns where none could logically exist. It was like seeing footprints in water, shapes that shouldn't hold but seemed intent on leaving a trace. Sometimes the fog's movements contradicted themselves. One moment it would drift east with the wind, the next it would climb back west, defying gravity and reason. I logged each instance, the entries stacking up so quickly that I wondered if the system might reject them, or if the rig itself would notice. The act of recording became mechanical, repetitive, yet every tap on the screen carried a tension I couldn't ignore. In that silence, the fog's presence became a constant companion, a judge as much as a phenomenon, assessing whether I understood the rules. Halfway through my shift, I realized I was no longer distinguishing between the fog's actual motion and my perception of it. Each logging session began to warp time, moments stretching or contracting in ways that made me question whether the fog moved differently, or if I had lost the ability to track it accurately. I could feel exhaustion creeping into my limbs, a slow, insidious fatigue that was not entirely physical. My eyes burned from staring at the pale screen light, but I couldn't stop. Ignoring an anomaly might be more dangerous than physical exposure. At one point, a sudden swirl of fog wrapped around the platform support just outside the office window, moving so quickly, I almost missed it. I froze, heart thumping, trying to decide if I had seen it at all. The tablet hovered in my hands as I forced myself to type, every stroke deliberate, every word chosen carefully. In the background, the rig hummed in its usual low tones, yet that hum seemed to pulse in tandem with the fog's strange, deliberate motion. For the first time, I felt a dissonance between the rules and my understanding of why they existed. The act of logging wasn't passive, it was communicative. I began to notice how the fog reacted to my observation, not immediately, but subtly, like a plant adjusting to light. It thickened in places I hadn't recorded yet, then withdrew from areas I had just finished logging, as if measuring my attention. That awareness made the next few minutes agonizing. I realized that writing down movement didn't just capture it, it seemed to influence it. The rig itself became secondary. The focus was entirely on the fog and my compliance with Rule 4. Minutes blurred into hours, and the monotony of logging became terrifying in its repetitiveness. My hands cramped, my back ached from leaning too close to the tablet, and still, I kept recording each subtle shift. Shadows of the rig's structure seemed to twist in rhythm with the fog outside, elongating and retracting in ways that made the room feel like it was breathing. I told myself it was exhaustion playing tricks, but the certainty in my chest told a different story. The fog would test me if I faltered, and that test wasn't something I wanted to imagine failing. When the fog rolled around the support column closest to the office, brushing just below the catwalk, I realized I had logged almost everything, but not quickly enough to feel safe. The awareness of imperfection settled like lead in my stomach, heavy and inescapable. I tried to write faster, but my fingers fumbled across the keys, missing small details, and I knew immediately that those omissions would matter. There was no error message, no system alert. The consequence was quieter, subtler, yet impossible to ignore. Later, I looked over my entries, rows of timestamps and motion descriptions, and I wondered how previous night supervisors had managed this without succumbing to madness. The logs were dense with movement patterns, yet each person before me had left slight variations, blank moments, or corrections that hinted at hesitation. I realized the rules weren't just about observation, they were about maintaining a certain state of engagement, a balance between notice and detachment that I was only beginning to understand. By the end of my shift, the fog had thinned slightly, drifting away from the immediate supports, yet the sense of vigilance lingered. I shut down the tablet, feeling a temporary relief that was more physical than psychological. Even though I had obeyed Rule 4, I couldn't shake the sense that the act of logging had drawn attention, rather than kept it at bay. The fog had its own agenda, one that didn't respect explanations or rationalizations, and I was left wondering whether observation was safety or invitation. I remember the first time I realized the fog could climb like that, wrapping itself around the rig, in a slow, deliberate crawl that defied both gravity and expectation. And at that moment, Rule 5, never step onto the maintenance catwalk when the fog reaches your waist, came alive in a way I had never felt with the others. My boots were on the metal grating, half visible beneath the murky whiteness, and each step forward made my legs disappear into the mist, as if the rig itself were swallowing me. The wind seemed to press in from all sides, subtle yet persistent, pushing against my body without moving the surface, making me reconsider every step I had taken in the past hour. I froze, weighing instinct against duty, the fog curling higher with patient inevitability. The maintenance catwalk is narrow, designed for inspections and minor repairs, but in the fog it became something alien, a path that could vanish in seconds and leave you suspended over the empty void below. I tried to convince myself that leaning on the railing was enough, that observation didn't count as stepping fully onto it, but my senses rebelled, warning me that any movement could be a violation. My flashlight cut weakly through the dense mist, its beam bending in strange ways that made shadows appear thicker, almost tangible, stretching along the rig's skeletal framework. Every metal support seemed to loom closer, the fog masking the edges and heightening the impression of falling into nothingness. I remember thinking about the other supervisors, those who had walked this deck before me, and whether they had sensed the same slow creeping weight of the mist. Footsteps that seemed solid one moment would feel suspended the next, and I couldn't tell if it was my mind or the rig adjusting to the fog's rhythm. I tried to focus on the task at hand, scanning bolts and joints for corrosion, but each blink seemed to shift the fog just enough to make the distance between supports untrustworthy. My heart pounded in an uneven tempo that didn't match the fog's pulse, a subtle reminder that fear is often measured in hesitation. I took one careful step, then stopped, the mist rising steadily toward my waist, brushing cold against the outside of my trousers. I felt the weight of compliance, the burden of knowing that breaking this rule wasn't just a matter of safety protocol, it might be a matter of survival. The rig vibrated gently beneath my feet, a reminder that I was tethered to a structure that could only partially protect me, and the fog's presence made the connection feel tenuous. For a brief moment, I considered retreating, retracing my steps back to the office, but the work required inspection, and hesitation felt like failure in the chain of command. As I adjusted my flashlight to get a better look at a corroded pipe joint, I noticed the fog seemed to respond, swirling tighter around the metal beams and reflecting my light in unexpected angles. It was subtle, but the movement carried intent, a sensation that my observation was acknowledged, almost measured. I realized that the act of looking itself could be a transgression, that attention in this context was more dangerous than ignorance. The fog's slow climb had become a test of balance, patience, and perception, and I felt the weight of it in every cautious breath. I remembered the logging from Rule 4, where I meticulously recorded movement, and wondered if the fog's behavior was related to my diligence or my mistakes. It was unnerving to think that simple observation could alter outcomes, that compliance didn't necessarily guarantee safety. The wind remained steady above the fog, but down here, it seemed to bend around unseen contours, wrapping the mist like a living thing around the catwalk. Each careful footfall on the metal grating sent a faint vibration through my legs, and I couldn't tell whether it was the rig responding to me or the fog reacting to my presence. I took a second step forward, counting in my head to maintain rhythm, though the fog erased any sense of distance. The railing offered a slim comfort, but I noticed small droplets forming along the edge, clinging in ways that defied normal condensation patterns. I felt a creeping awareness that the fog wasn't entirely weather, that it had properties that the rig's sensors couldn't detect. My flashlight illuminated patches of twisting metal and slick surfaces, each glint a reminder of both the structural complexity of the rig and the precariousness of my position. Halfway along the catwalk, the fog reached the tops of my boots, then my calves, and I felt a subtle panic, not loud or overwhelming, but precise and insistent. Each step forward now required conscious negotiation, a calculation of risk and compliance, and I realized the fog had its own timeline that I couldn't predict. I thought briefly about retreating, about breaking Rule 5 and stepping back, but instinct told me that hesitation here might be worse than disobedience. The fog's patient movement carried authority in a way that humans could not emulate, and I felt entirely exposed. I made it to the section that needed inspection, knees slightly bent, flashlight steady despite trembling fingers. The pipe joint was corroded exactly as the morning logs had indicated, yet examining it felt secondary to the broader challenge, keeping myself within the boundaries dictated by the rule. I worked methodically, knowing that any misstep might mean overexposure to the fog's influence. Each adjustment of tools, each measured motion, carried tension, a reminder that compliance with Rule 5 demanded constant awareness and respect. Returning along the catwalk was even more difficult, the fog now brushing my waist as if measuring whether I had learned the lesson. I counted each step, each breath, noting how the metal grated beneath my boots, and how the fog responded, curling and retreating, just enough to keep me off balance. It became a game of observation, patience, and controlled movement, where instinct had to be tempered by deliberate calculation. I reached the stairwell leading back to the main deck, feeling both relief and exhaustion, acutely aware that my understanding of the rig, the fog, and the rules had deepened in ways I couldn't fully articulate. By the time I returned to the night office, the fog had receded slightly, the platform above clear and normal in appearance, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the catwalk had transformed under my feet into something other than a simple passageway. The experience left me simultaneously respectful of Rule 5 and unsettled by the way it had manipulated my perception, my movements, and my awareness. I logged the inspection details, noting anomalies while keeping my thoughts guarded, aware that the fog would continue its patient, deliberate climb long after I left the lower sections. I remember gripping the controls of the main crane, feeling the weight of responsibility in my fingers, and realizing too late that Rule 6, never use the main crane at night when the fog is thicker than your line of sight, wasn't just a suggestion. It was a boundary I had no intention of crossing until circumstances forced me. The fog had settled like a living blanket over the rig, opaque and undulating, swallowing the lower supports and obscuring the ocean beyond. My headlights barely penetrated more than a few feet, and the usual lights marking the crane's hook looked dim and distorted. I told myself I could handle it. That experience and caution would be enough, but a tight knot formed in my stomach anyway. Operating the crane under normal conditions is methodical, a sequence of small, precise movements that feel almost meditative. At night, with fog interfering, everything becomes slower and heavier. Perception lags, depth is misjudged, and sound travels strangely across the metal platform. I moved the hook toward the shipment crate, calculating distance using memory and instinct instead of sight, aware that every misjudgment could be catastrophic. The fog seemed to wrap itself around the cable, thickening with each downward motion, almost as if it were aware of my actions and measuring my patience. I felt a creeping sense that the crane wasn't just a tool, but an extension of the fog's testing field. I glanced back at the night office, half expecting to see someone watching me, someone who might scold or intervene. Of course, no one was there. The rig was quiet, except for the low hum of machinery. Still, the sensation of being observed persisted, amplified by the shadows the crane cast across the fog-dense platform. The hook descended, slow and deliberate, and I realized my own tension was reflected in the subtle swaying of the load. Each inch of movement felt monumental, as if the fog itself were manipulating the weight and shape of reality around me. Midway through lowering the crate, I noticed the fog curling tighter around the crane's base, almost forming walls that shouldn't exist. The air smelled damp, salty and faintly metallic, as if the fog had absorbed some of the rig itself. I hesitated, questioning whether to pause or continue, knowing that stopping could mean exposure while moving might trigger unknown consequences. My fingers remained steady on the levers, but my mind raced with calculations and contingencies that didn't feel sufficient. The rig's vibrations carried differently tonight, a subtle shift that made me acutely aware of how isolated I was. Time warped in small, unpredictable increments, a strange elasticity that I couldn't reconcile. Seconds stretched into minutes without obvious reason, and movements I thought were swift revealed themselves later to have been painstakingly slow. I adjusted the crane's angle incrementally, measuring with both sight and instinct, feeling the fog brush against the load like a tactile warning. Every movement demanded conscious negotiation between action and observation, and I began to notice small anomalies, tiny shifts in cable tension that weren't mechanical, small ripples in the fog that suggested deliberate motion. The crate finally aligned with the loading bay, yet the fog made the drop feel dangerous beyond measure. I hesitated, questioning whether to release the cable or wait for a shift in the mist. The rules had not explicitly covered this nuance. They only stated that operating under poor visibility was forbidden. My training battled with instinct, and I realized that the fog's thickness wasn't just about line of sight. It was about timing, judgment, and unspoken authority. Moving forward became a negotiation with forces I didn't understand. I lowered the crate slowly, each inch a measured compromise. The fog clung to the hook and crate in unnatural swirls, obscuring the bay just enough to make it impossible to gauge alignment visually. My mind tried to compensate, calculating distance, speed, and timing, yet the fog seemed to introduce variables I couldn't quantify. My hands ached from maintaining a steady grip, and each breath felt like a negotiation with the environment. The rig vibrated gently, but the rhythm felt irregular, almost deliberate, a silent conversation between machinery and mist. When the crate finally touched the platform, the fog didn't recede as I expected. Instead, it seemed to thicken around the edges, folding back on itself like fabric being arranged for inspection. I froze, waiting for something to happen, something I wasn't sure I could define. The sensation of being tested pressed against my chest and spine, subtle but unrelenting. My relief at completing the task was muted, tempered by the awareness that obeying Rule 6 was not about mechanical success, but about endurance, observation, and restraint. I backed the crane slowly, inch by inch, retreating toward the control station. The fog seemed to flow alongside the moving cable, almost as if it had a will of its own, and I realized that Rule 6 wasn't simply about visibility, it was about recognition. The difference between performing a task and performing it in accordance with an unseen standard. The crate's weight shifted as I maneuvered, shadows forming on the fog like ripples of warning, each one demanding precise interpretation. I felt the tension in my shoulders intensify, realizing that each small misstep could escalate into consequence, unseen but unmistakable. By the time I disengaged the crane, secured the controls, and stepped back toward the night office, the fog had thinned only slightly, leaving the platform between me and the open sea murky but still untrustworthy. My body trembled subtly, fatigue mixed with a heightened alertness I couldn't shake. Even though I had obeyed Rule 6, the experience left me with the lingering sense that compliance was never complete, that the fog observed and recorded with patience beyond human measure. I logged the crane operation as usual, noting anomalies without commentary, and stepped away, acutely aware that the rig and the fog had conspired to remind me that night operations were never just routine. I remember the first time I stepped onto the observation deck, during a night shift, realizing too late that Rule 7, never enter the observation deck, when the fog covers more than half the platform, was as much about perception as it was about safety. The fog had thickened across the main expanse of the rig, curling around railings, supports and stairwells, with a slow, deliberate persistence that made distances impossible to judge. My boots rang softly against the metal floor, each step sounding heavier than it should, echoing against the steel in irregular patterns that set my nerves on edge. I paused near the entrance, hand on the railing, debating whether duty or caution held more authority in this moment, aware that moving forward could have consequences I couldn't yet define. The observation deck, normally a place of relative calm, felt transformed. Lights from the catwalks below filtered weakly through the dense fog, scattering into shapes that seemed to writhe when I blinked. I tried to rely on memory of the deck's layout, counting steps and estimating distances, but the fog created illusions of space and depth that disoriented me. Every structure appeared simultaneously closer and farther away, making navigation feel like walking across shifting sand. I realized then that Rule 7 wasn't about the fog physically obscuring my path. It was about how the fog could distort perception, turning familiarity into danger. I reached the first railing and paused, considering the view, though there was almost nothing to see. The fog had turned the platform below into a white void, and the sea beyond was entirely hidden. I pressed my palm against the cold metal and felt the vibrations of the rig, subtle tremors that communicated nothing, yet carried a strange weight of anticipation. Every instinct screamed to retreat, but training and a sense of responsibility anchored me to the deck. The fog was patient, waiting for hesitation or curiosity to betray me. I tried to focus on checking the sensors installed around the deck, flipping switches and noting readings, but my hands moved mechanically while my mind measured angles, distances, and the fog's subtle curls. Shadows of the rig's structural supports merged with the mist, creating phantom corridors and false openings that didn't exist. I realized that the deck was no longer just a platform for observation. It had become a stage where the fog dictated movement, pace, and attention. Each step required deliberate calculation, each gesture measured against an invisible standard I couldn't name. Halfway along the deck, a sudden shift in the fog caught my attention. It had coiled around a support beam, forming a dense pillar that blocked part of the walkway, and seemed to throb as I approached. My heartbeat spiked despite knowing the structure was solid, and I told myself to breathe steadily, though each inhale felt heavy. The fog was impossibly thick in some areas, almost tactile, and I instinctively leaned toward the railing, using it as both guide and anchor. It occurred to me then that the rule was less about avoiding the fog physically, and more about avoiding being psychologically overwhelmed. The wind above the rig whispered against the deck, teasing the fog's edges and creating the illusion of movement. I paused frequently, trying to reconcile the dissonance between what I knew and what my senses reported. My flashlight illuminated patches of railing, support and instruments, yet even those glimpses were deceptive, bending and stretching in ways that made me question my own judgment. The rule's warning seemed to exist for moments like this, when nothing else, the metal, the lights, the equipment, could be relied upon. I attempted to complete my observations, noting anomalies and potential maintenance issues, but the fog's density made it impossible to distinguish true issues from visual distortions. Every cable, every bolt, every light fixture became suspect, and I realized the real challenge was maintaining focus without panic. The deck stretched endlessly beneath the haze, and each step forward required constant reassurance that my footing was secure and my attention intact. The fog had transformed the familiar space into something unpredictable, testing my comprehension and patience. I glanced over the side briefly, expecting to see the sea or lower decks, but only the dense white persisted. Even my peripheral vision felt unreliable, as though the fog actively distorted angles and distances. I kept my flashlight sweeping slowly across the deck, knowing that overexposure to the mist's patterns might dull my judgment. There was an almost imperceptible tug at the back of my mind, a sense that lingering too long could have consequences I wasn't equipped to understand. When I finally began retreating, each step away from the fog-laden portion of the platform felt weighted with tension. The observation deck, once a simple vantage point, had transformed into a test of perception, patience, and resolve. I descended the steps with exaggerated caution, measuring each placement, aware that the fog seemed to linger at the edges, as though unwilling to release me entirely. My pulse remained elevated, my senses tuned to every movement, every shift, every whisper of metal or mist. By the time I returned to the night office, the fog had begun to thin along the edges, though its presence still clung to the rig in undulating swaths. I exhaled slowly, trying to release the tension I hadn't realized I'd been holding, yet a low-level anxiety persisted. Rule 7 had reminded me that rules aren't always about immediate safety. They're about maintaining clarity, restraint, and observation in situations that can distort both mind and body. The experience left a lingering unease, a sense that the fog had noticed my compliance, measured it, and retained the memory for future reference. I remember reaching for the switch in the night office, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility press against my fingers, and realizing with a jolt that Rule 8, never disconnect the emergency lighting. While the fog is thicker than the height of the handrails wasn't a suggestion. It was a lifeline I had no right to ignore. The fog had rolled in once again, dense and unyielding, obscuring the platform and turning familiar structures into shadowy silhouettes that shifted unnervingly with every breeze. I could barely see the nearest support beams, let alone the edges of the deck or the expanse of the sea beyond. Even with the main lights on, the fog swallowed their glow, leaving a gray-white wash that made depth impossible to judge, and my stomach twisted at the thought of what would happen if the emergency lights failed now. The emergency lights are designed to activate automatically in case of failure, but here in the fog-heavy night, their faint glow offered a sort of reassurance that nothing else could provide. Their bulbs are weak by day, but at night, they create small islands of clarity in a shifting void. I ran my hands along the wall, tracing the switches and checking the indicator lights, telling myself it was a routine check, yet the tension coiled in my chest like a living thing. Disconnecting them might seem mundane during daylight or calm nights, but here the fog created layers of uncertainty that made even a single flick of a switch feel like a gamble with consequences I couldn't predict. I took a step toward the hallway, measuring each movement carefully, aware that the fog's presence warped perception in ways I couldn't fully articulate. Every bolt, railing, and floor plate seemed to have shifted, though I knew the platform hadn't moved. The fog interacted with light and shadow unpredictably, creating illusions of depth and proximity that made the floor feel both solid and treacherous at once. My hands hovered over the switch for a long time before I dared to test the indicator, the air around me almost vibrating with quiet anticipation, the rig's hum suddenly seeming louder and oddly invasive. I remembered the prior rules as I worked, particularly Rule 7 about the observation deck and Rule 6 about the crane. Each one had been less about obvious danger and more about maintaining respect for unseen forces and unseen consequences. Rule 8 now made me acutely aware that the fog itself demanded attention and reverence, that manipulating infrastructure without considering its presence could be catastrophic. My fingers finally pressed the test switch instead of disconnecting it entirely, and the faint amber glow of the lights revealed only more fog, thicker than I had anticipated, moving like water over metal. The corridor beyond the night office stretched into ghostly ambiguity. Each step I took echoed, absorbed unevenly by the dense mist, making my own movement difficult to interpret. The fog clung to the walls, curling around supports, and at times it seemed to occupy space in a way that defied physical explanation. I realized the rule wasn't simply about illumination. It was about restraint and judgment, the difference between exercising control and provoking conditions beyond your comprehension. A simple decision could have unintended consequences when the environment itself was actively observing and responding. I started walking down the platform toward the deck lights, keeping my movements small and deliberate, my eyes tracing the faint outlines of handrails barely visible through the thick fog. Shadows lengthened and shifted, as if the fog were sculpting its own interpretation of the rig's geometry. Each flicker of the emergency lights emphasized the movement, creating a rhythm I couldn't ignore, one that seemed designed to keep me aware of my position, while reminding me how easily that awareness could be disrupted. The fog and light interacted in a way that made every familiar landmark feel alien, and I had to remind myself that the structure beneath my feet remained unchanged. Halfway along the deck, the fog thickened around my waist, rising like a living tide to obscure parts of the walkway, challenging every step I took. The handrails appeared like islands, but the space between them seemed distorted, longer or shorter depending on the angle and reflection of the emergency lights. I realized then that Rule 8 required more than compliance. It demanded an active awareness of the fog's behavior and a humility that my usual confidence hadn't prepared me for. The lights themselves seemed to be a mediator, creating a thin layer of order in a space otherwise dominated by chaos. I paused at a junction where multiple corridors met, unsure which path would lead safely back to the office. The fog was so thick here that the platform beneath seemed to disappear, leaving only the faint glimmer of amber light to suggest solidity. My pulse accelerated as I considered the consequences of disconnecting the lights in this context, imagining missteps or slips that could leave me exposed to more than just the rig's structure. For the first time, I understood the weight of Rule 8 in practical physical terms. The fog amplified danger in ways mechanical systems could not mitigate on their own. With careful, measured steps, I continued toward the exit, each footfall deliberate, guided as much by instinct as by what little I could see. The fog seemed to pull back slightly at my approach, almost respecting the path I carved through it, yet threatening to reclaim every inch the moment I faltered. I felt both relief and unease, realizing that following Rule 8 was as much about navigation of fear and perception as about the lights themselves. The mist, the glow, and the structure combined to create a tense choreography that I had no choice but to respect. By the time I returned to the night office, the fog had started to thin in patches, the glow of the emergency lights stabilizing the space enough for my senses to relax marginally. I exhaled slowly, noting that even a small act of compliance had required constant vigilance and awareness. Rule 8 had reminded me that the fog is patient, unpredictable, and capable of transforming familiar spaces into something alien and threatening. I logged the situation, careful to record the fog's density and movement without interpretation, and stepped back, fully aware that the night was far from over, and that obedience to this single rule did not guarantee safety, only survival of the moment. The first time I realized the lower storage tanks could become traps, I was halfway through a supply inspection, when Rule 9, never descend into the lower storage tanks, when the fog seeps through the vents resurfaced in my mind, with a force I hadn't expected. The fog had crept along the edges of the platform again, curling as if testing boundaries, and a subtle chill came up through the grated floor. I stood above the access hatch, glancing down at the shadowed opening, aware that the steel ladder disappeared quickly into darkness. The air smelled damp and metallic, and a faint whisper of moisture drifted up from the vents, carrying with it the scent of salt, rust, and something undefinable that made my skin prickle. The lower storage tanks are deceptively ordinary spaces during daytime inspections, fluorescent lights revealing orderly rows of barrels and piping. At night, with fog infiltrating through the vents, the tanks feel suspended in another reality. The vents exhale in irregular pulses, carrying both moisture and subtle vibrations, as if the fog were breathing into the space. Each step closer to the hatch made my heart beat harder, and I realized that Rule 9 wasn't just about avoiding physical danger. It was about recognizing when an environment itself becomes a hazard. The fog could change the space in ways the eyes didn't perceive, and the ladder, the barrels, the walls, all felt suddenly alien. I knelt and ran a hand along the cold metal rim of the hatch, testing stability and balance, the fog's influence prickling my awareness. Each time the fog pushed through the vents, a faint hiss accompanied the movement, subtle enough to be mistaken for normal ventilation, yet insistent in its presence. I felt my fingers tighten on the rim, gripping it like an anchor against invisible pressure. The deeper I considered descending, the stronger the sense of trance grew, as though Rule 9 was a line between observation and overconfidence, and crossing it might have consequences my mind was not ready to comprehend. The ladder disappeared almost immediately into the shadows, the metal rungs slick with condensation. I tried to focus on the texture beneath my gloves, the solidity of the steel, the routine of climbing, yet the fog's influence extended even here, making distances difficult to gauge. Each breath felt slightly delayed, as if the thick air carried a weight that slowed internal motion. I reminded myself that no mechanical hazard existed in that moment. The danger was perceptual, psychological, a test of patience and caution in the face of something unquantifiable. Descending was possible, but compliance with Rule 9 demanded a restraint I hadn't expected to need. I stepped back, hands still on the hatch, debating whether to finish the inspection by other means or ignore the rule entirely. The fog pushed against the rig's lower edges, teasing and curling, responding to the smallest movement. My thoughts raced. The storage tanks had been empty the last time I checked, yet now each barrel appeared heavier, denser in the shadows, almost as if the fog had mass and could apply pressure selectively. My mind refused to dismiss the sensation, and I realized that ignoring the rule wasn't just a physical misstep. It was a potential psychological trap. Looking around, I noticed that the vents themselves seemed to exhale differently when I focused on them, creating patterns in the mist that suggested intent. The fog's motion was subtle but deliberate, pushing along the ceiling, down the walls, and over the hatch like a soft warning. I remembered previous logs, where subtle anomalies had been noted but never fully understood, and it became clear that Rule 9 demanded both attention and humility. Compliance wasn't passive, it was active engagement with the environment, an acknowledgement that the fog had authority here. I stepped back further, weighing the need to descend against the instinctual warning. My flashlight illuminated patches of the hatch and the nearest barrels, yet the fog transformed familiar shapes into something uncertain. The more I studied the shadows, the more they seemed to twist and shift, elongating along surfaces and making the space below appear larger, deeper, more unknowable. I realized then that the rule existed for moments when perception itself could betray you, and the fog was an expert at exploiting such weakness. I leaned briefly against the railing near the hatch, trying to steady my breathing. The fog's movements had slowed slightly, curling along the edges of the tank area, and for a moment it seemed almost indifferent, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been tested simply by approaching. The chill in the air pressed against my spine, a constant reminder of Rule 9, and I understood that the rule's power lay in its subtlety. Ignoring it might not produce immediate consequences, but could erode awareness and judgment over time. Even from above, I could feel the fog pressing into the lower storage tank area, shaping perception and forcing attention to the edges, the ladder, the vents. Each breath carried moisture and uncertainty, and I realized that descending blindly could lead to disorientation, or worse, a situation where the rig and the fog combined to create a hazard no human rule could counter. I recorded the inspection from my current vantage, noting condensation and vent output while avoiding the descent entirely. Compliance felt like a small victory, but the awareness of risk lingered, a tight knot in my chest that refused to loosen. By the time I returned to the main office area, the fog had begun to retreat along the platform's edges, though its presence remained substantial and subtly threatening. I exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease slightly, but the memory of the vented fog pressing through the hatch stayed with me. Rule 9 had reminded me that some spaces are dangerous not because of physical obstacles, but because the environment itself can manipulate perception and attention. The night continued, and I remained hyper-aware, knowing that even compliance with this single rule required vigilance and respect. I remember that night vividly. Standing at the edge of the helipad, the wind carrying salt and a damp chill that seemed to thicken with each passing second, and realizing with a sinking dread that Rule 10 never approached the abandoned submersible. When the fog rolls onto the helipad was more than a guideline. It was a boundary drawn by some force I couldn't name. The submersible sat there, dark and inert, its hull slick with moisture and condensation, edges blurred by the creeping fog that seemed to move with intent. I wanted to stay back, to trust the rule, but the compulsion to check the instruments, to verify its status, gnawed at me. The fog wasn't just obscuring vision, it seemed to distort the space between me and the craft, lengthening steps and flattening angles in ways that made judgment treacherous. I took a careful step forward, boots clanging softly against the metal helipad surface, and immediately felt the fog curl around my legs, damp and cold, a subtle but unrelenting pressure that forced awareness into every motion. The submersible's lights were off, dark windows reflecting only the faint amber glow from distant platform lamps, making it impossible to gauge depth or shape accurately. I thought about previous supervisors who might have made similar inspections, and a subtle wave of doubt crept over me. What if the fog wasn't just a weather phenomenon, but a sentinel, measuring caution or daring? The rule suddenly felt less about safety, and more about compliance with something vast, patient, and indifferent to human logic. I forced myself to observe without touching, scanning the submersible's hull and instruments, but the fog's movement made perception nearly useless. Shadows formed where none should exist, lines bent and stretched, and the vessel seemed to drift subtly as though alive, responding to my presence. My flashlight cast beams that dissipated quickly into the mist, illuminating fragments of metal while leaving others obscured, creating a false sense of familiarity. I realized then that Rule 10 was less about the submersible itself and more about preserving clarity of judgment under deceptive conditions, a buffer against the environment's insidious influence. The wind shifted slightly, carrying droplets of fog across my face and dampening my gloves, and I felt a subtle pull to step closer, to examine details that weren't necessary. I resisted, telling myself that proximity wasn't required and that the rule existed precisely to prevent the temptation I was now struggling against. Every instinct urged observation, yet compliance demanded restraint. The fog moved along the platform in slow, curling currents, pushing at the edges of my awareness like a living thing, testing patience, attention, and resolve. I realized that disobedience here could create consequences that might not be immediate, but inevitable in their scope. I tried to take mental notes, cataloging the submersible's state without moving closer, but the fog made focus difficult. Each step I had taken felt exaggerated in retrospect, as if my perception of distance had been warped by the density surrounding me. The helipad itself seemed to shift subtly, slight undulations underfoot that might have been mechanical vibrations or might have been induced by the fog's presence. I felt the first prickle of fear in hours, not panic, but the calm, nagging sense that a single wrong movement could disrupt the fragile balance I was trying to maintain. I glanced back at the platform lights, seeking reassurance, and the fog seemed to respond, curling higher around the submersible, narrowing the visible area into a small corridor of clarity. My pulse increased, though I tried to maintain measured breathing, aware that the fog could exploit hesitation, making indecision an active risk. I reminded myself repeatedly of the rule, feeling its authority not in threat, but in subtle insistence. Some lines aren't drawn in ink or paint, but in experience, observation, and avoidance. The submersible remained inert, yet somehow present in a way that challenged comprehension. I lingered near the edge, glancing at the fog's undulating patterns and the shadowed form of the vessel, realizing that proximity could skew perception and judgment simultaneously. The rule's phrasing had always seemed cautious, almost mundane, but now its importance became clear. Approaching the submersible in this fog could compromise awareness, inviting mistakes that the environment would exploit. I felt the shift in perspective keenly, the deck beneath my feet subtly transforming under the weight of expectation, fog, and rule-bound vigilance. Compliance was not passive, it demanded constant, active engagement with my surroundings. Time seemed to stretch and compress, as I stood observing from a safe distance, each second expanded by the fog's presence and the unnatural stillness of the submersible. I noted details in my head, the minor scratches along the hull, the condensation pooling near the joints, the way fog collected around the access ports, and yet each observation was filtered through uncertainty. The rule had transformed from abstract warning into a living guideline, one that required conscious adherence to avoid unseen, cumulative consequences. My awareness of the fog's subtle shifts became a meditation, balancing curiosity against restraint, instinct against command. Finally, I stepped back toward the platform walkway, each footfall deliberate, keeping the submersible within peripheral view, but resisting the urge to close distance. The fog seemed to linger around it, curling and pressing slightly outward, as though marking the boundary between observation and transgression. I felt tension in my shoulders release fractionally, a slow easing that carried with it the understanding that compliance had preserved a delicate equilibrium. Rule 10 was less about direct hazard than about preserving perspective in conditions that could erode judgment, perception, and restraint. By the time I returned to the night office, the submersible receded into the fog's folds, partially obscured but still present in my mind. I exhaled fully for the first time in hours, but unease lingered, a constant reminder that obedience to Rule 10 was a negotiation with forces larger than the rig or the machinery. I logged the observation carefully, noting the fog's density and movement without approaching the submersible, and felt a fleeting sense of respect for the rule's authority. Compliance had preserved safety, yet the fog's patient presence reminded me that vigilance would be required throughout the remainder of the night. I remember standing near the central console, watching the fog crawl across the platform like a living tide, and realizing that Rule 11, never ignore the vibrations beneath the rig, when the fog rolls in thick enough to erase the horizon, was the culmination of every lesson the night had taught me. The metal beneath my boots pulsed subtly, a rhythm that seemed synchronized with the fog itself, faint but deliberate, impossible to dismiss. I paused, listening not with my ears, but with my whole body, feeling the tremors travel up my legs and into my chest. Each pulse carried a quiet insistence, a warning that demanded attention, yet it wasn't immediately obvious whether it was mechanical, meteorological, or something else entirely beyond comprehension. I crouched slightly, fingertips pressed against the grated flooring, trying to discern the source of the subtle shudders. The fog wrapped the rig in an opaque shroud, hiding every edge and casting shadows that moved independently of any light source. I thought about previous rules: the logging, the crane, the catwalk, the observation deck, and even the submersible. Each had tested vigilance, perception, and patience. But Rule 11 demanded a different kind of awareness. It required surrender to instinct, and the humility to acknowledge that some forces were beyond direct control. Every vibration was a message, subtle yet insistent, asking for recognition and respect. The more I focused on the tremors, the more the rig seemed to transform beneath me. Supports that had always felt solid now felt alive, responsive to the fog, shifting in ways that defied both intuition and physics. I noticed tiny movements along the handrails, faint bends in the metal that had always seemed permanent, and I wondered whether I was imagining them, or if the fog somehow altered structural perception. Each vibration became an anchor, a tether to reality that demanded careful interpretation. Ignoring it was impossible, because the moment I wavered, the mist would curl around me like a measuring hand. I stepped cautiously toward the stairwell, the vibrations becoming more pronounced, syncing with the fog's slow crawl across the platform. Every step was deliberate, my boots sounding louder against the metal grates than they should, echoing in ways that disoriented spatial perception. The fog, thick and suffocating, clung to every corner, wrapping columns, beams and cables in indistinct shapes that flickered with the faint glow of platform lights. I reminded myself again of the rule, feeling its authority in my chest and stomach rather than my mind. This wasn't about equipment, observation, or protocols. It was about recognition of something far older, larger, and indifferent to human design. Halfway down the stairwell, the vibrations changed subtly, becoming irregular, almost conversational, and I realized my focus had to shift from measurement to intuition. Each pulse through the rig demanded attention, a form of listening that wasn't verbal but corporeal. I adjusted my stance, bent my knees slightly, and let my fingertips brush the railing, calibrating each movement against the tremors. The fog curled at the edges of my vision, sometimes appearing to drift upward like smoke, other times pooling in deceptive hollows that suggested gaps where none existed. I knew instinctively that ignoring the vibrations would allow the fog to manipulate perception unchecked. As I reached the bottom of the stairwell, the fog pressed higher, filling the voids between supports, curling around machinery and ladders. The vibrations beneath my boots pulsed differently here, slower, deeper, resonating through every joint in the rig. My mind tried to rationalize, attributing the shifts to tide, wind, or machinery, yet none of these explanations accounted for the precise timing and intent I felt in each tremor. Compliance with Rule 11 was a negotiation between logic and instinct, awareness and restraint, and each choice felt weighted, consequential beyond immediate perception. I moved cautiously across the lower platform, the fog curling over equipment like living tendrils, the vibrations beneath my feet pulsing, as if tracking my attention. Every instinct screamed to retreat, yet the desire to observe and understand held me forward. I noted subtle changes, small slides of condensation, misalignments in floor panels, slight tilts in storage units, all amplified by the fog's presence. Each observation reminded me that the rig and fog interacted in ways imperceptible, yet undeniable, that every tremor carried a meaning layered beneath physical mechanics, a communication that demanded respect and response. Half an hour in, I realized that the vibrations had become rhythmic, almost deliberate, and I paused to isolate each pulse, separating them mentally from my own heartbeat, the rig's machinery, and the fog's motion. Each vibration became a coordinate, an anchor to orientation within the enveloping whiteness. I understood then that Rule 11 existed not to prevent an accident, but to maintain awareness of forces that could manipulate perception and decision-making simultaneously. Ignoring the vibrations would erode comprehension, leaving me vulnerable to errors that the fog and rig would exploit subtly but effectively. As I traced my way back toward the main platform, the fog began to swirl differently, curling at the edges, almost as if aware of my attention. The vibrations beneath my boots persisted, guiding, warning, asserting presence. I navigated slowly, avoiding abrupt movements, measuring each step against the pulse beneath me and the uncertain patterns around me. I realized fully that the fog vibrations and the rig together created a complex network of information, one I could interpret only through constant, active awareness. Compliance wasn't just survival, it was understanding and participation in a delicate equilibrium. By the time I returned to the night office, my legs were trembling, muscles fatigued from constant tension, my mind overstimulated by rhythm, perception, and anticipation. The fog outside had begun to recede slightly, leaving the rig's silhouette more distinct, yet the memory of every vibration lingered in my chest. Rule 11 had tested patience, observation, and instinct in ways that previous rules hadn't, and I realized that it wasn't just a boundary, it was a lesson in humility and attention, a reminder that some elements of survival cannot be mechanized or quantified. I logged the night's observations carefully, noting the fog's density and the unusual vibrations without speculation, keeping a record of compliance rather than interpretation. I leaned back in the office chair, exhaustion and relief mingling in my body, and watched the fog curl away from the rig's edges. The night continued, but I felt a quiet understanding settle over me. Obeying Rule 11 hadn't guaranteed safety, only awareness, and the fog would remember that attention in its own way. The rig pulsed softly beneath me, each vibration a subtle echo of lessons learned, and I understood that my night, the rules, and the fog were all entwined in a delicate balance that demanded respect. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.